You're listening to This Week in Cardiology from theheart.org on Medscape.
You can now access the latest in medical news on your Amazon Alexa-enabled device. Join me, Perry Wilson, every weekday morning for Medscape Medical Minute, where I highlight the top medical stories of the day. To add Medscape Medical Minute to your flash briefing, search for Medscape Medical Minute on Amazon and click Enable. Or open the Amazon Alexa app, go to Skills, search for Medscape Medical Minute, and click Enable. Then say, Alexa, what's the news? Or Alexa, what's my flash briefing? I hope you'll join us.
Hi everyone, this is John Mandrola from theheart.org Medscape Cardiology, and this is This Week in Cardiology for January 14th, 2022. This week, xenotransplantation, weight loss drugs, DOACs, vitamin D, left atrial appendage closure, and recalled LVADs. First is the pig heart transplant. Wow, I just don't know what to say. Previous attempts at xenotransplantation failed due to rejection. This time, the pig heart was seriously genetically modified to help prevent rejection. Get this, 3 genes associated with antibody-mediated rejection had been knocked out in the pig supplying the transplanted heart, and 6 human genes associated with immune acceptance of the organ had been inserted into the pig's genome. If this works, even over the short term, it seems more a story about molecular biology and gene modification therapy than transplant. And I know it sounds crazy, and perhaps this is, but I always like to remind my younger listeners that when I was in training, biventricular pacing and AF ablation were not only not invented, but had not yet been conceived of. So it's really hard to predict the future. We shall see. Next topic, weight loss. As some of you may know, I led off my column on the best stories of 2021 with the fact that semaglutide, a glucagon-like peptide-1 GLP-1 receptor agonist, produced significant weight loss in patients with obesity. Now, JAMA has published a recent RCT comparing semaglutide, which is a once-weekly injection, with liraglutide, which is once daily. The trial had about 340 patients. One group got semaglutide, the other liraglutide, and each had their own placebo. Now that was necessary because one is once weekly and one drug is once daily, so it's a somewhat open-label trial. The primary endpoint was the percentage change in body weight, and the bottom line was that semaglutide produced a 15.8% decrease in body weight versus placebo, versus 6.4% with liraglutide versus its placebo. Now, the proportions of participants who discontinued treatment for any reason were 13.5% with semaglutide and 27.6% with liraglutide. GI adverse effects were reported by 84% with semaglutide and 83% with liraglutide. This looks like a clear win for semaglutide, but we have to be careful here as the authors lay out in the limitation sections that patients knew their group assignment. This is because liraglutide is once daily and semaglutide is once weekly injections. Now, they didn't know they got placebo or the drug, but it's possible that those in the once weekly group knew they were in the semaglutide arm, and if they had done their homework, they would know that the drug seemed more effective in previous studies, and therefore they could have changed their behavior and ate less food, for instance, and that's where the weight loss came from. To have overcome the open label problem, the investigators would have had to use a double dummy approach, which would have meant giving patients in the semaglutide shots 6 days per week. The other limitation is that the higher discontinuation rate with liraglutide may have been dose-related, as it was started at a higher dose, which is according to the prescribing info for liraglutide. And finally, there was missing data from 9 in the semaglutide group, 10 in the liraglutide group, and 7 in the placebo groups. And recall that there were only a little more than 100 participants, so this is a not small amount of missing data. And my comments are, while the GI side effects are there, obesity is such a major health problem. These drugs hold great potential. And as for dosing, which we discussed last week regarding once daily or twice daily DOAC drugs, a medication given by injection once weekly is going to outperform a medicine injected once daily. Now, Novo Nordisk, the makers of semaglutide, is studying an oral form of semaglutide for weight loss. The drug was approved for the treatment of type 2 diabetes in 2019. With GLP drugs now and SGLT2 inhibitors, the world of cardiology and diabetology are coming together and continuing to merge. We cardiologists are going to have to get much more comfortable in the diabetes space. Next topic is DOAC coverage, insurance coverage. In the U.S., a large insurer, CVS Caremark, has excluded apixaban from its formulary. Now, this is a huge move because oodles of American patients who take apixaban will need to switch to rivaroxaban or pay full cost for the apixaban. And for the vast majority, perhaps 99% of the population, this is not feasible. Apixaban is just too pricey. Now, the layers of bureaucracy and the rent-seeking groups that our American healthcare system encourages defies easy explanation. But this is an especially egregious move by third-party payers. And I know, regular listeners heard me last week criticize a flawed observational study that purported to show superior outcomes with apixaban compared with rivaroxaban. My opposition to this move, which is clearly driven by profit motives, is not because I think apixaban is the superior DOAC. Now, it may be, but we simply don't know. My opposition to this move is that the two drugs are different enough that this sort of non-medical switching is an overstep. I mean, it's one thing to prefer one ACE inhibitor or ARB or statin or beta blocker, but there are really only two DOACs commonly used, and we ought not to be forcing patients doing well on apixaban to switch. There's just too much uncertainty and differences in the medicines, in my opinion. Journalist Patrice Wendling has nice coverage of the details, and do read her news piece on the Heart.org Medscape Cardiology. Now, this story makes the podcast not just because it exposes the terribleness of non-medical rent-seeking entities into the doctor-patient relationship, but also because it exposes the problems inherent in a healthcare system driven by profit motive. Now, be sure, my friends, CVS Caremark is not evil. They are simply responding to incentives. The problem is almost never with industry or insurers or hospitals or doctors. The problem is with a system that has broken incentives. Now, of course, I'm a clinician. I don't have policy solutions for American healthcare. I only take this opportunity to remind listeners of the matter of trade-offs. As the great Thomas Sowell famously said about policy, there are no solutions, there are only trade-offs. Now, I, for one, having visited many cost-constrained healthcare systems in Canada, in the UK, in Poland, and I like the trade-offs in these systems better than I do here, where corporations like CVS can cause millions of people to switch DOACs. Now, there are no perfect healthcare systems. There are simply healthcare systems with different trade-offs. Next topic, vitamin D. Now, 2 more RCTs of vitamin D supplementation came out this week. Both studies looked at supplementing vitamin D in people without vitamin D deficiency. One is in The Lancet, 21,000 Australians and over 5 years of follow-up, and no difference in the primary endpoint of all-cause mortality, nor any difference in cancer death or CV death. The American Journal of Clinical Nutrition also published a smaller Finnish study of older adults without vitamin D deficiency, and also found that over 5 years, vitamin D supplements did not lower the incidence of major cardiovascular events or invasive cancer among older adults. Now, my comments here will be brief, but I will point out that the BMJ published a massive meta-analysis of 50 trials and 75,000 patients looking at vitamin D and found no reduction in all-cause mortality. This was published in 2019, and I'll link to that paper. You also have the null findings from the 25,000 patient strong VITAL trial that I've covered previously on this podcast. My only question is that why in the world are we still burning money on vitamin D supplement research? What I tell patients about vitamin D is to go outside and play as much as possible. This is good for your health, and I don't need to spend millions on an RCT to know it. Okay, next topic, left atrial appendage closure and frailty. I have debated left atrial appendage closure as the antagonist now on 4 continents, and the first time I did, against Professor Horst Sievert in Germany, who's one of the world's foremost proponents. He said in the question and answer session that the least likely patient to benefit from this procedure is the old and frail patient. Now to an important paper published in the Heart Rhythm Journal by the Beth Israel group of Robert Ye, Dan Kramer, and first author Alan Wang. They used Medicare fee-for-service claims to study patients older than age 65 who had appendage closure from 2016 to 2019. Patients were identified as frail based on the Hospital Frailty Risk Score, HFRS, and this is a previously validated way to measure frailty. They simplified the groups into patients with low, intermediate, and high frailty based on this score. Now, the observational study included nearly 22,000 patients, and get this, nearly half of which were considered frail, 11,000 patients, including 15% in the highest frailty group. Now, mortality rates at up to 3 years were 16% for the low-risk group, 27% for the intermediate-risk group, and 41% for the high-risk group. And after adjusting for age and sex and comorbidities, the highest frailty group compared to the lowest frailty group had an 8x higher risk of prolonged hospital stay, 6x higher rate of death at 30 days, and 3x rate of death at 1 year. Now, the authors also note a high prevalence of dementia in 1/5 of the overall cohort, but in nearly half of the highest frailty group. The authors conclude that frailty is common in patients undergoing appendage closure and is associated with increased risks of long hospital stay, readmissions, and short-term mortality. My comments on this important study. This is yet another example of procedures approved via trials that recruit younger, healthier patients that are being used now in older, sicker, and frailer patients. And really, left atrial appendage closure is not alone here. ICDs, AF ablation, PCI, TAVR are often done in patients unlike those in the clinical trials. This is also an important use of registry observational data, as it is being used not to make non-randomized flawed comparisons, but rather to tell us what we are actually doing in real-world practice. The specific findings here that A, almost half of the patients who get appendage closure in this series were frail, and that B, frailty confers a super high risk of poor outcomes, including short survival. Now, why is that important? It's important because left atrial appendage closure is a strategy that trades a higher upfront risk of problems, procedural complications, and say bleeding complications due to the need to take short-term antithrombotic meds. It trades it for longer-term benefits from being off anticoagulation. That is, if you believe there are any long-term benefits. I do not believe that. But for the sake of argument, let's say there are long-term benefits. These would accrue over years. In fact, the Watchman authors themselves have published a post-hoc study of PROTECT and PREVAIL looking at, quote, net clinical benefit, and found that early, the net clinical benefit favors warfarin because of the procedural complications. And the net positives, the net clinical benefit for the device takes 3 to 5 years to be realized. So if you're implanting this device in patients with high frailty scores who have a poor 1 to 3 year survival, you may actually be creating a net harm due to exposing them to the upfront risk, and they don't live long enough to get the net clinical benefit, even if there was one. I am particularly troubled, and you should be as well, that nearly half of the patients in the highest frailty group had dementia. Now, not only does dementia confer a poor long-term prognosis, it also raises the possibility that these patients could not possibly meaningfully participate in the shared decision-making that is mandated before having this preventive procedure. I really want to commend the authors for doing this research, publishing it in a very clear paper, as it forces our community to reflect on what appears to be extremely dubious patient selection of an already dubious procedure. I've long held that many preventive interventions help doctors and hospitals more than patients. And when we put these foreign bodies into older, frailer individuals, it seems extremely likely that we're benefiting ourselves and our employers far more than we are helping our patients. This is a very sad and sobering paper on many levels, but it should be read and it should be discussed. Final topic today is very brief. There's an LVAD device recall. The Heart.org Medscape Cardiology has published a news piece on the regulatory failures surrounding the Medtronic HVAD left ventricular assist device. In June of last year, Medtronic ended sales and implants of this brand of LVAD. But here's the thing, that was in 2021. But in 2014, FDA had published a warning letter describing serious problems with the pump. Now, this is a complicated story, and I want to learn more about it before covering it further. Look for more on this coming in future podcasts. I realize that post-marketing device surveillance needs improvement, but there must be some explanation for why it took 5 years to halt implants of a faulty device. If you have any references or know about this issue, please let me know. I'm interested. So that's it for this week in cardiology. As always, I'm grateful that you listened. Thank you. And remember, friends, if you like this podcast, please take the time to tell a friend. Give us a rating, review, write a sentence. It really helps others find us. And if you disagree with anything, please, by all means, give me a note in the comments on the heart.org Medscape Cardiology webpage. Until next week, this is John Mandrola from the heart.org Medscape Cardiology.
You're listening to This Week in Cardiology from the heart.org on Medscape.